Hello and welcome to Books to Last, the podcast that challenges readers to pick the only 5 books they may take with them when cast away to a mystery remote location. As ever, I'm joined by a book-loving guest, and this episode I'm joined by Nick. Welcome, Nick. It's so great to have you on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for giving me some of your precious time, especially in this very, I don't know, where I am, cold and dreary winter where I just want to curl up and read and not socialize at all. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're coming out of winter here, so I understand that.
For the benefit of any listeners who might not be familiar with you, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and books?
Yeah, so my name's Nick. I have a Bookstagram account, and that's my foray into the book world. I can't say I've been like avid reader my entire life. I know folks in the Americas, like growing up during school, we have like reading programs where you get points for the number of books you read and everything. Did that when I was growing up, but then I feel probably typical for a lot of guys as I got into high school and in college, fell off reading and didn't really keep reading, and picked it up over the last, or like into college and moving into my professional life and adult life and everything, and been really trying to pick up more and more books every year since. So, it's been fun.
That's great. I always find it really interesting when people have come to reading as a hobby later on, because for me personally, I read a lot when I was younger because that was just my thing. But if I hadn't have done that, and say it was like my grandmother really read quite a lot, if I hadn't have done that, I think when would I ever have like just ended up picking up books, because life so easily gets in the way. I think it's always kind of nice when people have come to it maybe not as an innate part of their being.
Yeah. Growing up, my mom was a huge reader, tons of books on the shelf. She'd be reading a few books a week, it felt. But yeah, after I graduated college, my job was moving around from state to state, living on my own. And so I was looking for something to fill the time and dove back into reading, and really enjoyed it since.
Awesome. What was the last sort of great book that you could...
So my current read is actually one of the books today, so I'll keep that one secret for now. But my favorite book of last year was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's I think the first time I've read something like that, probably. It's obviously a very popular book on Bookstagram and everything, but it just really captivated me, and I think it was the second book I read in the year or something, but just constantly stayed at the top of all the books that I was enjoying. Just couldn't put down one of those reads.
Yeah, Addie LaRue's kind of... I remember finding it really difficult to find in bookstores when I read it, because it's not a one genre book, really, because it's not quite fantasy, but it's not quite romance. It's it transcends a lot of, and I found it really hard to find on the bookshelves. Because the author, obviously, V. Schwab, is a sort of more commonly known as a fantasy writer, and it just, I always love the books where when you read them or you try to recommend them to someone, you're thinking, I don't even know what genre this is in, because there's all this other stuff in it. Like, where would this even be shelved in the library?
Yeah, something that kind of like bridges genres is always nice. I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, but a sci-fi book that has a romance element or something like that, it adds an extra enjoyment element to it.
Definitely. And what do you... So you say you're a sci-fi reader. Do you tend to jump around to a lot of genres, or just stay with one?
I think I'm a bit of a mood reader. Definitely read more sci-fi and fantasy than anything else, I think, but I'll jump to historical fiction or like a contemporary fiction as well. Sprinkle a little nonfiction in there. I've been taking advantage of audiobooks to knock out some nonfiction I've got on my shelves recently. I switch based on what my mood is.
Yeah. A lot of people I know find nonfiction easier to digest in like audiobook form. It feels like a mini podcast series from like chapter to chapter, I find. And I definitely like my nonfiction in audio. I'm a bit the same, jumping around, mood reading. Although at my core, I always identify as like a sci-fi fantasy reader. And I said that to my book club recently. And they found it hilarious, because I've brought almost exclusively 19th century classic fiction in with me to almost every night.
Yeah.
So they were just like, you read fantasy? And I was, yes, I cut my teeth on fantasy. That's what I read all of my chat.
Yeah, I wonder if it's the for reading sci-fi fantasy all the time, the contemporary fiction stuff, they stand out more because they're so different from everything else we read.
But it's fun. It's fun to dabble around. I am looking forward to hearing about your list then, because I feel like it's going to be really varied and different.
I'm hoping so, yeah.
Which is always fun. As ever, our guest gets to pick their own mystery remote location, because we don't really do desert islands, although if you want a desert island, you can have one. Before we dive into your 5 books that you're going to take with you, where would you like to be to castaway to?
Yeah, I feel like I had a couple options bounce around my mind. Listening to some of the previous podcasts, I like the people that are like, I'm just going to pick a fantasy location. I'm going to smash locations together and make it what I want it to be. But what I think ended up might have some recency bias, but my wife and I went to Bavaria in the Munich area last fall. And we went to the town of Garmisch outside of just south of Munich and right in the Bavarian Alps foothills and stuff. And I think something like that setting would have to be what I pick, like these crystal clear alpine lakes right at the foot of majestic mountains and everything that you can sit out and read with a beautiful view.
Germany is just like, it's one of my favorite places I've ever been to ever. It's just great.
Yeah, we absolutely loved it. I think we living in the US, we always want to go to all these different European locations, and trying to pick one to settle on is always hard, but we loved the time that we were there. We were there right up leading to Oktoberfest, so tagged that on the end and stuff as well, but it was a really lovely time.
Yeah, it just goes to show usually the thing that's the most distant to you is what you want, because in this part of the world where we're quite close to Europe, we're like, oh, Europe's kind of, that's just like on our doorstep, whereas everyone here, their dream destinations, like they want to go to Mexico or the Caribbean or like Canada or even like the US. Some people just think of all of the different states of the US as like their own different countries because they're also different from each other.
Yep.
And that's where they want to go. And like Europe's kind of so to them. And then all of my US friends, when I speak to them, they're like, oh, how do you pick when you've got like Paris and Germany and just everywhere, just right on your doorstep?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely get that.
Everyone wants what's far away and elusive. Okay, so you're in some sort of cabin, probably a log cabin in the Bavarian foothills. You've got gorgeous views and great weather. What is the first book you're going to be taking with you?
Yeah, so I foreshadowed it earlier, but I think my first book is going to be my current read, which I got them all stacked next to me here. But it's The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So this is my second Brandon Sanderson. I know like the Cosmere and all of his novels are so popular, but I'm just getting into it myself. And I think a lot of your guests, I was like, I need something beefy, like that's got a lot of page count to it that I can really dive into. And I'm sure you appreciate being a fantasy reader, the world building and all the different things you can dive into and appreciate. I was really looking for that. And so maybe the recency bias of being in it right now shaded me this way. But yeah, for those of you that don't know, Way of Kings is a kind of epic fantasy novel set in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere universe, but it's kind of like medieval-ish based, but the world has a bunch of different species and they're all kind of humanoids. And that's something that I've picked up over the course of the book is you think all the characters are human, but then you're like, oh, wait, this is like a reptilian kind of humanoid character. And then this one's others, and it's got magic throughout and like history sprinkled through in there and everything.
Detailed sort of high fantasy. He's really good. Cosmere is not one I've been brave enough to even go near. Just yet. With you saying that you like sci-fi and that sort of thing, I actually got my first taste of Brandon Sanderson with the Skyward series of his, which is a sci-fi novel that he's written, but he really cleverly weaves high fantasy sort of themes and elements. But in this, I really enjoyed that series. But because I read that first, in my head, I'm very fixed in this sort of sci-fi world. So when I read Mistborn, which is the other series, one of his other big series, it's also really clever. But it's just he can do both so well. And I agree. Way of Kings it's in such a big world that every time you reread it, you'll probably pick up new Easter eggs and new pieces of information that you disregarded the first time you read it because
Yeah,
you didn't know what was going to happen later.
absolutely. And it's interesting you say that because having read only the fantasy parts of the Cosmere so far, that's what I associate Brandon Sanderson with. And you have the opposite side, starting on the sci-fi. I started with Tress of the Emerald Sea. It's the first Sanderson novel I tried to be, because it was supposed to be standalone. It technically ties into the universe, but I was like, let's try them out with the low commitment of not feeling like I need to read the next book in the series and everything. So I tried that one out and enjoyed it. And I was like, okay. Everybody was advising Mistborn is the place to start, but I was like, I'm feeling epic fantasy, so I'm just going to dive straight into Way of Kings and try it out.
Mistborn is it's very different to anything I've read before, and it's one of the only series I've read all the way through in recent years, because not that I don't enjoy series anymore, but I used to monotask series for use to get some productivity jargon in there, but I would just zoom through the whole series, because this was back when they were all out. And then I read a bunch of series where they weren't out in their entirety.
Okay.
I had to wait for one, and then once I'd waited, it's like the spell was broken, and I'd either not finish it, or then I would read them, and I'd read the book spaced apart. Whereas I feel like authors like Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, even Terry Pratchett to an extent, when I decide I want to go into them, I feel like I want to clear my schedule reading wise and just read them for however many months it takes.
Yeah. I feel like I get myself in trouble with series because being like a bit of the mood reader, like I said, like I'll start a series and be like, okay, I finished that one. I want to switch it up and try something else. And then I don't come back to it for a year or two. And then you're like, what happened last time? Yeah. So there's a few series that I'm like 2-3 books into that I need to try to get back into. The Temeraire, I don't know if you've ever heard that one. It's Naomi Novak. It's like a...
Vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird one. It's dragons, but Napoleonic Wars. And it's very up my alley. Yeah. Yeah, and so it's very up my alley, and I've read one book, but haven't gone back to the second one in a year.
I definitely feel that. I tried to sort of dive back into Game of Thrones, and I think I got 4 chapters in before I was like, I do not know who any of these 4 characters whose perspectives I'm reading from are. I don't even know whose side they're on. I have no idea what's happened. I need to go back and reread all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll learn with Way of Kings. They just published the last one in this, at least, mini-series within the broader series. He said he's going to do another one, but...
Brandon Sanderson should write like a productivity or like writing book, like a non-fiction one, to say how he does it, because that man is like a machine with what he produces.
Absolutely. I occasionally get the videos on Instagram recommended where he's talking about the class that he teaches. It's at a university in the U.S., but I feel like it's be quite the undertaking.
I get so jealous, especially like because American universities have like quite a lot of this, where they have quite sort of big names teaching like these really interesting sounding things. And I mean, I've already been to university. I have no desire to go back, but I heard Stephen Fry was teaching some kind of like a media course in the UK in one of our UK universities. I forget which. I want to say it's probably like Oxford or something. And when I was like, Stephen Fry, I was like, I would go, but I would pay for a term at university to be taught by Stephen Fry.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the same could be said for if Brandon Sanderson or Rick Riordan want to do any kind of course, I would pay to sit in that university hall.
Yeah, I feel like in my head, love the idea of going back to school just to learn and not have to do homework or any of the other stuff. But I imagine once I was actually in the class, I'd be like, okay, I'm bored now.
See, I would like, I like love the idea of it, and I think I probably would enjoy it, but it's very much like the part of my brain that's like, yeah, but bills, but also job. Just, I find it very hard to motivate myself to do something unless it's going to fulfill a certain thing at the end of it. And the idea of me like purely selfishly going to do like a history degree for 3 years just for the fun of it, I'm like, I cannot justify that money, that time.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah, it's like a what if you win the lottery type situation.
Yeah, if I won like millions, I would just do like loads of degrees, and I wouldn't care what grade I got in them because I'd be just there for fun.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got a big fantasy tome of Brandon Sanderson's. How far through it are you?
A little over 700 pages, and I think it's like just about exactly 1,000. It's almost 3/4. Yeah.
And I'm very tentatively anxious for you that you're taking this with you without knowing the ending, because Brandon Sanderson loves like a cliffhanger. Don't you want to know what happens next? And
Yeah, that is definitely a risk. I feel like I've just absorbed through osmosis on Bookstagram that there's like a surprise ending to this one and a surprise ending to a lot of his other ones, but I'm risking it and we'll see.
love a gamble. It's got to be good. You can always let people know how it goes once you've read the end. Okay, big fantasy tome for the first book. What is the second book you'll be taking with you?
Yeah, so hopping genres. I think the second one that I'd take is the book that got me back into reading after I graduated college, and it's Artemis by Andy Weir. So he's, very popular for The Martian and Project Hail Mary, but found this one at a bookstore while living on my own and gave it a shot. And it's classic adventure sci-fi like The Martian, but it's set on the moon, like a moon base, and the main character is scoundrel. It's like a classic like heist novel where someone does something and then gets themselves into more trouble that they've got to figure out to get themselves out of this bigger web and everything. But the thing that really hooked me with it is that I have an engineering background, and Andy Weir is very much, I'm going to get all the technical details and do all the scientific research and everything. And so throughout this book, he's saying, oh, this is how they built the moon base. It's got like double thickness walls and all these things. And I feel like it'd really satisfy the like nerdy part of me to be like absorbing that information repeatedly and constantly reading it in my remote Bavarian cabin.
I have heard about Andy Weir that his science is usually pretty good. So yeah, it's I still haven't read The Martian. I keep saying and go because it's been picked loads on the podcast, and I want to listen to the audiobook because it's like a diary log, isn't it? So I thought,
okay. Yeah, I've not read the book. I've watched the movie, and so this is the only book I've actually read by Andy Weir, but I heard from everybody else about the others.
it's not one of his that I've heard of, actually. So I like how it's like a deep cut Andy Weir sort of pick. But when you said it was called Artemis, I was like, oh, I wonder what the theme of this. And then you said it was the moon. I'm like, of course it's the moon. She's the goddess of the moon. That was really, really stupid not to see that go.
Yeah. I guess I didn't think about that either, but that's fair. Yeah, I think it's not as popular as the other two. So I was looking up the summary on like Goodreads before the podcast just to remind myself of some of the plot details and stuff. And I noticed some people that I know had rated it a bit lower than mine and said that, oh, it's too sciencey for me. So I wonder if it was kind of one of his first published novels, so that he was like going hard on his science stuff. And then he was like, okay, maybe I need to step this back.
I think as well, it's like with Brandon Sanderson, whatever your intro to an author is, does colour your view of what the rest of their work is. So if your intro is like The Martian, which it probably is for most people, then maybe that's the perspective that they're coming from. But I do a slightly off-piece novel for pick for an author that a lot of people have heard of. I feel like if he carries on writing in different parts of the solar system, I'd really love to see a box set of them where the spines is the solar system and the planets are on whichever planet is on the spine. I feel like that'd be really good.
Yeah, that'd be beautiful. There's so many beautiful box sets out these days that do things like that. It's crazy. I don't know how people get the money to afford something.
It's definitely a big consumer. I don't fall. I only like 50% of the time. I have to really, really, really like a book or series to want the special editions, and then I convince my husband that it's a good idea by being like, I'll put it in value.
Yeah, I feel I criticize it. Reading Way of Kings, I found a hardback at a local bookstore, and then I'm like, if I get the second book, I've got to get it in hardcover. We got to have them next to each other. I can't have a hardcover in the paperback.
The problem with Brandon Sanderson as well is all of his books have been released in like really premium leather-bound editions on like the Dragonsteel website, and I've looked at them, they all cost quite a lot of money, and it is absolutely lethal because they're so gorgeous. But I'm just like, if I'm getting a whole series and that, it's going to cost, I'd have to take out special insurance just
Yeah, yeah. I've got a coworker that won, I think, the first three books of the Stormlight Archive, the Wave King series, and they're all signed, but won them in a competition. So it's, oh, she's got it set. She's got like the first three perfect.
That's retirement sorted. We've got some hardcore fantasy, hardcore sci-fi. I like that you're going really purist with all of the genres that you've got for each.
Yeah.
What is the third book that you'll be taking with you?
So I think my third book is my cozy read that would just go for kind of comfort read. And it's, I guess you'd say it's like contemporary fiction. It's The Door-to-Door Bookstore by Karsten Hinn. It's originally published in German, and I found a translation in the US. And I actually read this book on my honeymoon a year and a half ago. And it's just like a classic for the people that like The Man Called Ove. That's a really popular one. It's the crotchety old man that befriends a young child, and they melt his hardcore exterior and everything. But I just found it like super cozy and inviting read. Yeah. Yeah. They have single words for entire ideas in English.
It's efficient, just like
Yes, it's very
just
true.
like almost everything from Germany. It's brilliant. So is it one that can you really tell that it's translated fiction? Because obviously it sounds like you knew going in that it was translated fiction. Would you have been able to tell anyway, or?
I don't think so. I didn't notice anything. I mean, the thing, I try to read a fair amount of translated fiction, and I always love like the different tone and storytelling style that comes across, but I didn't notice like any stunted English or anything like that where like it wasn't quite tracking. I think it's a really good translation.
I like I say, yeah, translated fiction's really. I find it really fascinating just on its own merit, because I've read some books translated from French. Like I read a sci-fi series translated from French once, and the translation was amazing. I didn't know it was translated by French, but it did explain a little bit of the tone in some of it, because everybody was very sort of exclamation points and very dramatic in the way that they spoke, and I'm like, that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think this one maybe lends itself to the subtler tone, since it's kind of like, yeah, and it's set in like a small German town, and I think it's like a old medieval town, like a walled city type situation. But the idea that there's like a local bookshop, and an old man has been their delivery man for 40 years for people that order books over the phone and stuff. And so he just walks through people's doors that don't actually want to leave the house to go pick up their books, and eventually stumbles across a young girl that decides to tag along with him as he's doing this, and slowly melts his exterior.
No wonder he's so grumpy. He's been carrying books for 40 years. They're really heavy.
Yeah, yeah.
Just based on the looks I got from Mara, our postman, during lockdown when I was getting loads of books delivered to my house, and he'd just show up at my door with a stack of them, the look he would give me as if, and he knew that they were books because he could tell from the logos on the side of where they'd come from. The looks he would just give me, I'm just like, yes, I'm very sorry that I've made you carry all of these parcels again.
It's understandable. Books are not a light delivery task.
But good on him. He's doing great work. That's a really, I like that, because you hear a lot of the cozy sort of theme and genre is very popular at the moment. I can't imagine why with them. Okay, yeah, I can't imagine what the appeal is, but it's nice that they're also translating, and there's like branching out as opposed to the usual places you could find. That's really, really good.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of that cozy stuff coming in translation. A Man Called Ove was translated. I think he's Swedish, maybe. And I've seen a lot of Korean and Japanese translated works that hit that cozy vibe as well.
If I was going to make a list of countries in the world that sort of ooze cozy vibes, I would probably go with like Germany, Japan, most of the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah,
that they've all got it going.
Yeah, they're checking their boxes for sure.
And perfectly themed for your location as well. So you've got a great...
Yeah. I didn't even think of that ahead of time necessarily, that I was picking a German book for my German cottage, but yeah, it does work out.
Yeah. Sounds amazing. I feel like this cottage is got to be like made of, I don't know, it's going to be like the cottage from Hansel and Gretel is made out of sweets and stuff, because like
That'd be very dangerous for me. I've got quite the sweet tooth, so I might be eating my lodgings.
Yeah, yeah, maybe the structural collapse isn't enough of an incentive. Stop that. Okay, so we're at the midway point. We're on the penultimate book. Which is the fourth book you'll be taking with you?
Yeah, jumping in, this one going into the historical fiction category, and it's not a translated work, but it is set in the Korea, Japan area that I mentioned previously. So it's Pachinko by Benjin Lee. Don't know if you heard this one, but I was listening to the episode.
I've seen it on shelves, definitely. The name is...
Yeah, I think it's gotten a little bit more popularity recently because Apple TV was doing a TV show of it as well. But it's similar. I listened to one of your last podcasts and somebody picked some historical fictions that are like multi-generational family stories and like telling of family trauma and everything. And so this one is it starts pre-World War II kind of Japanese occupation of Korea, and then follows a young girl as she becomes involved with a Japanese man, eventually moves over to Japan, I think, and follows her family as Korean immigrants into Imperial Japan and then post-World War Japan. And as they move through society, being Korean immigrants into Japanese society at the time and all the kind of strife that they have to go through and everything. And I thought it was just beautifully written and really impactful, and something, at least in the United States, as with a lot of countries, I'm sure we don't necessarily tell the history very well of other countries and other regions of the world. The U.S., we focus a lot European history and then American history post the American Revolution, and everywhere else is, some stuff happened over there. So it's nice getting the perspectives on these big events in other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's been a running joke on the podcast that here in Britain, we like to teach all of the history where we come out looking good, which, as you can imagine, is not a lot of...
Yeah.
As considering Britain has fulfilled the role of villain of the world for the last 1,000 of years, we were only taking a brief hiatus, so past however many.
The U.S. likes to follow that model of history teaching, I think. It depends on where you grow up. I grew up in Illinois, but live in North Carolina now, and so it's states that were on opposite sides of the U.S. Civil War. And hearing from my wife, who grew up in North Carolina, comparing her education of that time period versus my education, it's not so stereotypical where it was like, we were on the good side or they were on the bad side type stuff. But there's definitely a different tone to some of the lessons and stuff.
Yeah. It's with selective history teaching, I find it's less to do with what's said, it's more to do with what's not said and where the line is, which parts of it the light is shone onto and which parts are avoided.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I love there's so much historical fiction out there, especially international historical fiction, that's filling those gaps, because realistically, almost every country, I would assume, because I wouldn't profess to know all of them, but presumably the majority of countries teach the history of their own country, and that is censored in the way that the government at the time wishes it to be.
Yeah.
It's a really great pick. And have you seen the screen adaptation?
I watched the first episode, but I still need to continue on to it. I've heard great things, but I haven't dove into it. But yeah, I think, like you said, the historical fiction is a great way to learn about other parts of the world, and it's great that it's so widespread nowadays, and it's like giving a lot of opportunities to learn about my mom is like a big fan of World War II historical fiction, particularly the Western Front, France, England, the Holocaust, things like that. But I've seen historical fiction about like the Ethiopian War against Italy, and yeah. But it's cool when they get prominence and people learn about these things that you're never taught about unless you're from those areas.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and even if it is involved, I only learned sort of in detail about like the British occupation of India through a podcast series called Empire, and it's just great to sort of really deep dive into these areas, because I mean, history is it's so fascinating, and I just find it I think that probably, if I was going to pick a degree to go back and do, I'd love to do a history, but I'd want to do one that sort of focused on colonial, like colonization and sort of empire and imperialism and that sort of thing, because I just find it just spans the world, and it's just really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if I went to school for history, I'd definitely pick an area that is not the United States. I think Eastern Asia, the Far East and stuff, like very limited content in American history classes on that. So it's always interesting learning about that. Or the Middle East. A lot of focus on it in the current day, but we're never taught about the actual history of how it got to where it is now and stuff.
Yeah, and it's like, just honestly, I could probably talk the whole podcast about history and historical fiction, because it's great. I just love it. So, but yeah, we definitely don't have time for that. I feel like you've probably got things to do for the rest of your day. I probably need to go to sleep at some.
I understand.
So we'll shelve that and maybe have a conversation another time about
spin-off
that.
podcast coming soon.
Spin-off podcast just about history. What is the last book that you'll be taking with you?
Yeah, the last book is, once again, new genre. I guess it's the fantasy sci-fi-ish, but it's a comic book. That's the other way that I got back into reading, was when I was in college. Living like in what was a 4-bedroom apartment, but by myself for the summer for an internship. I was like trying to find time. Went to a comic book shop near the campus and started reading comics. And I grew up on, DC and Marvel cartoons and everything, and so really dove back into that. And the last book I chose is Hawkman, volume 4, from a few years. That's probably pushing 10 years ago at this point, but volume 4 called Hawk's Eternal, and this is by Robert Venditti and kind of collection of artists. But Hawkman,
I love Robert Venditti.
Yeah,
sorry, he adapted the Percy Jacksons into graphic novels.
Oh, okay,
so he's
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the little bits that I've read from him. He's had a few series for DC that I've picked up, and I think Hawkman is where it got started, and I was like, oh, I like this, and tried out some other ones and stuff. But Hawkman is kind of one of those classic comic book characters that has a very convoluted and messy backstory that people constantly chopped and changed over the years. And I think Robert Venditti took this series as like I'm going to try to consolidate all this into something that makes sense. And so, Hawkman, Hawkwoman, their whole premise is, they're like originally these ancient Egyptians had some sort of accident that now they continually get rebirthed, and they die and get reborn and eventually find each other and become heroes. And over the course of this series, he's slowly putting you through the history of these characters and saying when they're in ancient Egypt and the American West, but then they're also on like other planets and getting reborn across the galaxy and everything. And it eventually builds up to some climactic event that is stereotypically comic booky, and this like eternal villain they've been trying to face and having to bring all these heroes together to help them defeat it and put them on a good path moving forward and everything. But just as much as I love comic books and everything, I wanted to pick some sort of comic book. One, just for the kind of pure fun aspect of something to read, and then also the art just being another thing to look at as well. There's some comic books I considered that were like, I just love the art. The story might not be my favorite, but the art is so beautiful. But this kind of struck the balance of, good classic comic book art, but also a fun story as well.
Hawkman and Hawkwoman, I've seen them in a bunch of, every time they try and include them in a TV show or some kind of on-screen adaptation, I always find it really interesting how the writers choose to pick and choose and manipulate what their plotline is to shoehorn them into whatever it is they've already established in their existing world.
Yeah.
But I suppose as a concept, as two characters, they're actually quite right for that, because they have the whole reincarnation storyline and part of built into how they work. And I think it's an interesting concept to have a rolling timeline like most comic books do, but you can set them in any time period as opposed to having to rethink and rewrite the backstories like with, I suppose, Steve Rogers, where they basically keep on making Steve Rogers be part of, I don't know.
A different war was his original war, yeah.
It's trying to attach him to a different war, or when they make any character essentially try and move their timeline up to something more modern.
Yeah, it makes it easier for them. They can just say, it all happened. They were in World War II. They were in the Wild West. They were in ancient Egypt. There's just different versions of them every time. And it is, like I said, a clean version to resolve that rolling timeline issue.
See, don't need to go down the route of Captain America. I don't think it's Captain America moves. There is a character. I'm completely blanking on all of my comic books.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's been ages since I've read them.
Punisher moves? Yeah, I was thinking of Punisher might be the one that moves, because I know I've seen like Vietnam-esque stories with him, and then also...
He moves wars, and famously, Steve Rogers does not, because he has to fight Nazis to exist, basically.
Yeah, he's got to get frozen in the ice after punching Nazis.
Yeah, my head was literally just like, who's a soldier and also a superhero? And obviously Captain America was the first that popped into my head. I'm like, that's not.
Yeah.
Okay, so definitely branching across all genres, and yeah, I love a comic book pick. The art is like one for me. That's usually the main reason I'll read the graphic novel, because I really like a novel that deep dives into the story. If I'm going for a story, usually I'd probably go for something prose, but I want really awesome artwork and concepts and action. I'm like, graphic novel.
Yeah, and if I'm just chilling in my cottage, I can not even worry about reading the story, just go to specific pages and stare at them for an hour, because, there's all these different details and everything.
Yeah. Hawkman's really, there's not a kid coming on. That's not because it's not good. I just think it's because it's one of those more niche characters that's like not as wildly popular as the ones that we see on having films all the time. So
yeah, it wouldn't have been my favorite character if I had to pick one or anything, but I'd heard about it when the series was first coming out, and they were like, he's doing a really good job of like redefining the character, and tried it out, and they were right. He really nailed it, in my opinion.
Yeah, one of my missions with my son is I just keep on teaching him really niche super. Just giving him those. He loves Batman, but like we're going like real niche with the different villains that we.
Yeah, it's a good time for that. I feel like DC in particular is giving their big writers, hey, take this character and just run wild with them. Tom King and Mitch Gerrits and stuff did their not Mr. Miracle. They did a Mr. Miracle, but yeah, and then go ahead. Yeah, Mr. Miracle was great, and then they did Adam Strange as well, which is just like a weird niche character too. So they've been having fun just picking the niche character to play with.
Yeah, I think the Batman movie was really good for that, because they did some real deep pulls on like real villains from the Batman Rogues Gallery. Like Condiment King is in the Okay, so we've had all 5 books. Could you just recap all 5 of them for anyone who might want to quickly make a shopping list to take to their local independent bookstore?
Absolutely. Got to support local, right? So book 1 was The Way of Kings, which is book 1 of the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Book 2 is Artemis by Andy Weir. And then The Door-to-Door Bookstore by Karsten Henn. Pachinko by Minjin Lee, and Hawkman Volume 4, Hawk's Eternal by Robert Venditti.
Awesome. Was this a difficult list for you to put together?
Absolutely. I was telling my wife how about I'm going to list a handful of books here that I need to pare down, decide which ones I'm actually going to pick. I had 2 lists going of the normal prose books, and then a few graphic novels that I was like, I need to put a graphic novel in here, but I don't know which one I want to pick.
So is there any honorable mentions that you'd want to quickly throw in that you couldn't quite make onto the 5?
Yeah, I think there's 2 that almost took the place of The Way of Kings. I was looking for the epic fantasy sword and sandals kind of era. So yeah, the other options were back to the Game of Thrones, like you mentioned, Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is technically a collection of like short stories by George R.R. Martin, and it's all set 100 or 200 years, I can't remember, before like the main storyline of A Song of Ice and Fire, and it's just following a hedge knight, a knight that's not associated with anybody as he goes through the countryside. And it's the most enjoyable Game of Thrones thing I think I've read, and it hits on all those points of all the different houses and the history that there's sprinkling into there, but I just really liked the characters and everything. And the other option was Shogun by James Clavell, which obviously very popular with the critically acclaimed TV show that came out last year, but it was a historical fiction of ancient samurai era Japan, and English sailor goes in and kind of witnesses big historical events in Japan. So
I've heard very many good things about Shogun. I have still, to my shame, not watched nor read it, but it's one of those things when you're taking on, like you say with the series, taking on a bit, it's like taking on a big project almost, and it's making sure you're going in with enough resilience to get through.
It's another beefy one too. I think that's another like 1,000 or so page book. So
yeah, I love that. See, I say that's a really big book. I love a 1,000-page book. Like one of my favorite books is like 1,200 pages.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's something about just being able to immerse yourself in that page count and then just like the world for so long.
Because there's like a real sense of achievement. If you're not in a rush to get it finished, it's you make your way through, and then all of a sudden you've only got like a few pages left, and it's a whole experience, and it's so detailed. But then I always get to the end of it and go, I feel like I didn't take in enough detail. Do I need to read it again?
Yeah, which I guess makes it good for this type of situation. I've been reading Wave Kings for a month, and I still have 300 pages left. I pretty much have a whole book left, and
well, that's quite good, really, isn't it? Because I find if you've got to take it slow, because it's going to take you a while anyway, you get to really think about what's happened in each chapter. I love a book where you get to the end of a chapter and you go, wow, that was dense. I need to process that for a bit before I move forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Nick, thank you so much for coming on and talking all about your favorite books. It's been good fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved it.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. Thank you so much. If anyone wanted to follow you and your book recommendations and hear more about the things you're reading and maybe find out if the ending of The Way of Kings makes you regret this journey, where could they find you?
Yeah, the only social media I really use is Instagram, and I'm at booksunderthewoods on Instagram, and post periodically on there based on when I finish books. Can always be better for the folks that are like, you gotta post every day to manipulate the algorithm and everything. It's like, I'm gonna post when I finish a book. And
yeah, I completely feel that. Every time I think, oh, I should really do this social media thing properly for the podcast, I'm like, no, there'll be a post when there's a new episode, and if I think of something to post, I was like, I just can't produce content on a schedule. That's just not how it works.
Yeah, I go through waves. Like the start of the year, I was like, I'm excited about Instagram. So I, made a few different posts and scheduled them out. So I was like posting every day for 5 days in a row. And then after that ran out, I was like, I don't know what to post now. So I guess I'll just wait until I finish the book.
Yeah, very much my whole thing. I'll sort of last a couple of scheduled posts and then go, oh, I really needed to schedule out time to then schedule the next batch. And then I never did that. So for periodic posting from both myself and Nick, do go follow Nick. And you can follow the podcast at Books to Last Pod on Instagram. I think you can still follow it on Twitter, but I do not post on there. I don't even post when the episodes go live on there anymore. I think I still have the account so that I can keep the name, and that's probably about.
Makes sense.
But if you wish to follow the account, you're more than welcome to. Mainly posting over us Instagram, and you can follow the podcast wherever you're listening to it now or wherever you find podcasts. Thank you so much for coming on, Nick. Listeners, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, bye for now.